Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. The COVID pandemic has exposed and in some ways exacerbated problems that have always been lurking just beneath the surface. One prime example is K-12 education. The disproportionate effects the pandemic has had on the educational attainment of people of color and in low-income communities has increased concerns over that gap, that that gap may be increasing. The surplus in the state budget and with federal funding indicates that there's going to be an influx of additional dollars going to K-12 education in certain school districts. A large portion of that state funding is going to come through something called the local control funding formula. Recently, the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California did a study on whether this increased funding for high-need school districts is actually improving school outcomes. The author of that report, Julian Lafortune, is our guest today. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks, Mark.
So Julian, let me begin with this. Can you give our folks a little background on how schools are actually funded? Where exactly does the money come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So California's K-12 schools are mostly funded through state and local dollars. So the state provides the largest share, about 60% of total funding. Local revenues, and this is mostly from property taxes collected on local properties, that contributes a little less than a third. And then the federal government chips in the rest, around 9% in most years, mainly through the Title I program and the National School Lunch Program. But as you mentioned, this year, there's a lot more federal funding.
Yeah, and so let's focus on state funding for a second. So, prior to this thing called local controlled funding formula, how exactly were the state funds allocated to school districts?
So before the local control funding formula, or LCFF as it's sometimes called, we had something called the revenue limit system. So there's a set amount of funding per student. It was generally similar across districts. The state basically would top off whatever a district didn't raise locally through their own property tax revenues. And then there was a system of state categorical grants, so programs that districts could apply to and get additional funding on top of that. And so what LCFF did was to get rid of this system and consolidate it together into a single funding formula, a weighted funding formula, so that districts with more high need students get additional funding per student on top of a base grant. And that's referred to, the additional funding is referred to as supplemental and concentration grant funding. So
I'm sorry. The key thing to remember, I guess, with the old funding was they had these things called categoricals. So basically, he who has the gold makes the rules. So if the state was providing the funding, they were saying, here's how you're going to spend it. With LCFF, it's more, you tell the district, you spend it the way you think you need it, right? It's more flexibility.
Yeah, so it's more funding for high need students, and then it's more flexibility and autonomy on behalf of districts.
Okay, so the idea behind the local control funding for LCFF is a lot easier way to say it than saying that long term each time. But the idea is to provide more money for high need school districts. How exactly are high need school districts defined?
So first, they're defined based on the number of high need students they have. And the state defines high need students as those that are either low income, English learners, or foster youth. And so the way the formula works is that it gives 20% on top of the per student grant for every high need student. And that's what's called the supplemental grant. Then districts, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated, districts that have more than 55% high need get an additional grant on top of that, the concentration grant, that tops it up to 65% per additional high need student. And so to put that in simpler terms, basically a district that's 25% high need, they get about 5% more on top of their base grant. A district that's 50% gets 10% more. And then because of the concentration grant, say a district that's 75%, they actually get 28% more funding. So there's a lot of additional funding for those very high need districts.
Okay, we've got a minute left in this segment. I didn't want to ask you this. All this extra money, how's it being spent? What is it being spent on?
Yeah, so for the most part, what we've seen is that it's being spent on staffing. And that's not really a surprise because that's what most districts' expenditures go towards. So districts that saw, the large LCFF funding increases, they spent a lot of it on teachers, other support staff like counselors or librarians, nurses, teaching assistants. But one area that it also went to were pensions and health benefits, right? And so these, with additional staff come additional benefit costs. And then these benefit costs have also been going up a lot for districts. And so
And
that
a lot
means
of people don't understand that the benefits costs are a huge part of overall compensation. It could be 40% on top of the wages. So it's really significant. Then you've also got the issue of pensions. That liability keeps increasing. So there's a need there. What about administration? Is much money going toward administration?
So we didn't see large increases in administration. It's generally a small category, and we didn't see large increases, roughly proportional with what you'd expect given just the overall funding increase.
And what about class size?
So class sizes went down across most districts, and even more so in the districts that got more funding. And so that's mainly coming through just hiring of a lot of new teachers, especially during the early years of LCFF.
Okay. Well, up next, how well targeted are these dollars? Are they generally spread across school districts, or are they getting to the high need schools and high need students that really need those dollars within those school districts? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Julian Lafartoon, a research fellow with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California, who specializes in K-12 education. And Julian, I want to ask you about, school districts that are receiving this post-LCFF local control funding formula money. Is this a situation where all districts are getting more money, or is this kind of a zero-sum situation where the high need districts are getting more money and the lesser need districts are getting now less money?
Yeah, this is it's an important question, and it's something that's actually often misunderstood. And so since LCFF was passed, we've seen funding go up across basically all districts of high and low need. And that's largely due to the recovery from the budget cuts of the Great Recession. But under LCFF, the increases are concentrated in the highest need districts. And so in a sense, we've been fortunate enough in the state to have an economic situation where funding is going up in general because of the improved fortunes of the state since the recession, and then we're directing even more of that money to the highest need districts since LCFF was passed.
So the good news is the state is awash in cash, and so nobody loses out with LCFF. Question comes if revenues go down, then what? What happens to some of those lower need districts in terms of the money that they received? And they've seen articles now coming out where enrollments are actually declining in certain districts, and there's a whole other issue there. So let's talk about these high need students. Where are these high need students? I assume some of them are in middle and high income districts. Are they losing out on this funding?
Yeah, so of course, high need districts are defined based on their high need students, but it's not exclusively that the high need students are in the very highest need districts that get a lot of funding. In fact, 20% of the state's high need students are in districts that don't get any concentration grant funding at all. And if we look at the middle, say between those that are between 30 to 80% high need, these districts serve half of the state's high need students, nearly 60% of the overall student body of the state, and yet they haven't seen as large of increases under LCFF. So they're not losing necessarily, but they're not benefiting to the same degree, especially their high need students aren't, as they might in other districts.
Yeah, that's not quite. They're getting some, but not as much as ones in the concentration districts. So you've got high need schools within school districts, but it seems like the way the money is allocated, it's really going to the school districts and not specifically to the school sites or to the high need students individually. Just how well then are these funds, these local control funding formula funds, targeted?
Yeah, so this is really a key question, right? Financial decisions are made at the district level, and that's where we target funding. But what we ultimately care about is, how they spend it. Do they spend it district-wide, or do they send it to the schools that generate the funding based on the number of high need students that they have? And so we don't actually have great data from the state on this. But what we did in our report was to look at the data the federal government collects on school site level spending. And when we do that, we saw that in California, basically for every dollar that a school site generates in additional funding, additional supplemental and concentration funding, we see their spending go up by 55 cents. So it's evidence of partial but not complete targeting. And that doesn't mean that funding was wasted or goes nowhere. It's just really that it's spent more equally across school sites than the way that it's generated.
Yeah, there was though, I think it was in your report. The state auditor did a report and found that some districts, when the money's left over, they just roll it back into the general fund.
Exactly.
That's not really getting to the target. That's not really targeting those high need students.
No, and so there's been a fix to that, but in general, it's something that we found also varied a lot by district. So some districts did a really good job of targeting and even targeted funding in ways that go kind of beyond what the LCFF formula would suggest, whereas others spent more equally across their schools.
And the reality is that salaries and benefits, as we spoke earlier, are a huge part of a budget. And you start hiring teachers or giving wage increases, and then that rolls over and impacts budgets because now everything else is more expensive. It does eat up a lot of those dollars. So what are some of the obstacles to better targeting these local control funding formula funds?
Well, I think one, and this is maybe more of a technical point, is just that a lot of services are paid out of the central office. So maybe they're meant to serve high need students. That's hard to know, and that can be hard for districts to allocate as well. You can think of something like an instructional software purchase, right? Perhaps meant to help struggling students catch up. That's something that would be hard to say whether that's perfectly targeted or not. But back to the staffing issues that you mentioned, that's really one of the more concrete obstacles to targeting funding to a specific site. It's hard for high need school sites often to attract and retain experienced teachers. And so what they do actually is often you see that high need school sites have more staff, more educators, so lower class sizes, but they have less experience and kind of less credentialed educators as well. So in a certain sense, it's kind of a quality versus quantity trade-off. And that's, might constrain how effective the funding policy actually is.
Yeah, so at some of these high need districts, what you're finding is they have just less experienced staff.
Exactly. So less experienced staff, just more of them. So they spend more, but they have lower paid, less experienced staff.
Okay. Well, up next, has the state increased funding for high need students had a measurable impact in test scores and graduation rates? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Education is the number one expense in the state budget. Currently, California spends $120 billion alone on K-12 education, and that's educating 6.7 million students. Are we getting our money's worth? We're talking about that issue with Julian Lafartoon, a research fellow with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California and an expert in K-12 education. So, Julian, is there any concern that the dollars generated by this local control funding formula, a formula, I guess you'd call it, is it really being used to supplant or supplement K-12 education spending for high need students?
So this is always a concern, and we don't have perfect data when it comes down to what students are actually getting themselves at the student level. But we do know that LCFF led to higher funding increases in the districts that have the most high need kids. In turn, spent more on teachers and support staff and lowered class sizes and provided new instructional materials. And then within districts, spending is higher in the schools with more high need students. Even if the dollars aren't perfectly targeted, they're still somewhat targeted. And so all that is to say, we have pretty good evidence that the funding has led to real increases in the resources for high need students.
Okay, so it's doing what it was intended to do. So the latest revisions in this local control funding formula increased this thing called the concentration grant from portion from 50% to 65%. Are there any stipulations on that extra funding?
Yeah, there are. And, as we talked about earlier, one of the struggles that districts have is attracting and retaining experienced staff at high need school sites. And so part of the rationale for this increase from 50 to 65% is to improve staffing at high need school sites. So districts will have to show that they're using this extra funding to increase and improve staffing at their high need school sites. Of course, whether this works to address disparities in either experience or credentials or staffing levels, that remains to be seen. But the hope is that the additional funding will at least be helpful for districts to do that.
It sounds though, when I was reading that from your report, it sounds a little bit like the old categorical, imperative kind of thing, where your categorical funding, where you're saying you got to spend the money on this. They're going kind of back to those attaching some strings to the money.
Yeah, and maybe in the long term, this is more of like a pendulum swinging, right? We swing from one level where it's a lot of state control to a lot of autonomy, and then perhaps we're on the backswing, so to say.
That's a really good point, a good way to look at it. So has this, I guess the bottom line is, has this targeted funding resulted in greater student success? And has it narrowed the educational gap between the less affluent and the more affluent students? With talk about things like graduation rates, college, course prep course completion rates, eventual earnings of folks. I mean, is it making a difference?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, that's the big question, right? How is this improving outcomes for students? In our most recent report, we looked at this and we found that in the highest need districts that got the concentration grant funding, the funding led to improvements in test scores, both in math and ELA, English language arts, across grades. And it also looks like there were increases in A through G completion or college preparatory completion. And so that's the good news, that districts that saw the most extra funding are seeing positive improvements in outcomes. And of course, the hope and expectation is that these academic improvements lead to greater earnings or economic mobility down the line. Of course, it's still too early to tell there. The less positive news is that the narrowing of the achievement gaps haven't really been as impressive and slower. And so part of this is because the funding targets districts and not students. And so some of the state's high need students just aren't in the districts that got a lot of this additional funding.
So the districts are getting funding, but not dollar for dollar flowing directly to the school sites or to the high need student themselves. It gets siphoned off into different things at the district.
Exactly. So, where it's targeted, the funding is working, but there are just a lot of high need students that are either in schools or districts that aren't, seeing as much of a financial boon from the formula itself.
It doesn't sound like a lot, but I was reading your report, and it shows that high school student graduation rates are increasing from 82.7% to 84.3%. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot of people. We're moving in the right direction. The last thing you mentioned is the test scores for some of these high need students are also improving at a faster rate than the rates for the non-high need students. So it's, again, the idea is to close the gap. This appears to be doing that to some extent. We've got about 30 seconds left in this segment, but I want to ask you this. How should we interpret the magnitude of these changes? Are these big changes, medium changes, small changes?
I think the kind of simple answer there is just when we look at the places that got a lot of funding, these are big changes. They're kind of, I'd say, modest to large increases, but the gaps are large as well. So even in these very, high need districts, we estimate it might take 14 or so years to close the gaps. If, of course, a lot of assumptions, if these, gains continue as they have. And that's just in the places that got most of the money.
But anyway, and I did see that in your report, the 14-year figure, and that's kind of, in some ways, it gives you hope that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. If we just stay at this, we can close this gap. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the policy implications and recommendations when it comes to state funding for K-12 education. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking about state targeting of K-12 funding and student outcomes with Julian Lafartoon, who is with the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. He's a research expert in K-12 education. And we're now talking about the policy implications and recommendations of this local control funding formula approach. So the state's been using LCFF in K-12 education for about a decade now. Has it improved the equity and efficiency of California's educational system?
I think in short, the answer has to be yes. Funding is more equitable across districts. We target need now within the formula in a way that we didn't before. Districts have greater flexibility and they're not as constrained by the categorical programs that were governed by Sacramento. And you might expect that then improves the efficiency in which districts can deploy resources. And then when it comes to outcomes, we have a growing body of evidence that this extra funding led to improvements, particularly for the high need students in the highest need districts in the state.
So the answer is at least a qualified yes. Let me ask you this though. You did come up with 3 broad recommendations for policymakers if they seeking to really improve the LCFF's ability to deliver on this promise of closing the educational achievement gap. So let's talk about each of them. The first recommendation you had was improve tracking and transparency, particularly with this funding to high need students. What exactly would you like to see done there?
Yeah, so we have data right now that tracks spending to the school site level. That's collected by the federal government, not with the purpose of evaluating LCFF. So we really don't have state level data that's meant to do that. And then on top of that, when we look at the federal data, it shows that districts vary a lot in how much or how little they target spending to these high need school sites that have the students that generate it. And that's an area of concern. But we really need better data if we want to say, definitively that this district is, targeting its high need students, or that high need students in general are really seeing all of the additional dollars that they're raising.
It's the other issue too is this is probably going to require different accounting mechanisms, and that's probably going to result in a need for training of these school district staffs on how to actually implement that, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, it's not without cost, right? It requires changes in district practices and reporting. Some districts already do this. So, there'd be lesser changes, and some districts might have a more difficult time. But of course, at the end of the day, I think this type of at least transparency is something that's necessary, for parents or policymakers or researchers like myself to really fully understand where the dollars are going and are they reaching, the students for whom it's intended.
Yeah, and the reality is, and yes, there are a lot of high need students in some of the larger districts, Fresno Unified, Los Angeles Unified, but there are a lot of small districts in the Valley that are high need districts that probably don't have that accounting and technical expertise, probably are going to need some help along these lines. The second recommendation you had was to consider funding mechanisms based on school site need. It's not school district, but school sites. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so this comes back to the district versus school level distinction, right? So we target funding to districts, and districts get even more funding if they have high levels of need or concentration, so to say, but that's not true for schools, right? So there are some high need school sites that have concentrated poverty, concentrated student need, but they're in districts that maybe themselves are a little bit more moderate or maybe even more affluent in need. So about 12% actually of the state's highest need school sites with this concentrated need and poverty fall into this bucket and miss out on some additional funding.
Are you at all worried though that school districts might segregate school sites, concentrate the high need students into 1 or 2 schools?
And exactly. That's the big worry of this. It's, I think, part of the reason that we didn't do that from the beginning in LCFF. So any sort of, remedy here has to be very careful that it doesn't create a new incentive for districts, say, to segregate school sites even more. That would, obviously be worse than kind of any increase in funding.
Because people are going to play to the rules, right? If they know what the rules are, they're going to play to their advantage. Last recommendation you had was consider increasing supplemental grants and/or lowering the threshold for concentration grants. Got just about 45 seconds left, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so what we really meant by this is that it'd be useful to kind of simplify and smooth out the formula. Right now, there's a big kink in the formula, a big increase that happens at 55%, and that now goes from basically a 20% to 65% increase in funding. And so the districts that are really high need get a lot of funding. Those in the middle don't get as much additional funding. And so kind of smoothing out this formula, either by increasing supplemental grants or kind of lowering that threshold to a lower amount, is something that would really enable the formula to reach more of the state's high need students with this additional funding.
And you can see all this by looking at the PPIC reports by going to ppic.org. I want to thank our guest, Julian Lafartoon with the Public Policy Institute of California, for joining us. And thank you for joining us. This has been the Maddy Report. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.